Okay, colleagues, we are a couple minutes behind, so we'll get started, and I will call this special meeting of Selwyn Council to order at 3:32 p.m. on Thursday, May the 13th. Members of the public, staff, presenter, and members of council, please be advised that meetings are broadcast and recorded and made available on the internet. I ask any of the council members, do you have any pecuniary interest in general nature thereof? Madam Clerk, please note that there were none noted. We have no minutes, and we have one deputation, which is going to, I think Nick is going to lead that. And Nick, I believe there you are. And so I'm going to turn it over to you in a minute. I just want to go through a couple of things though first. So what we're going to do is ask Nick to do his presentation and to go through it. Then I'm going to ask each of the councillors to ask their questions. So I'm going to start off with Councillor Ballantyne, then go to Deputy Mayor Senes, and then Councillor Locke. I understand that Councillor Heron is not able to be with us today. And then when my three colleagues have concluded, then I will ask a series of questions, and we'll have a back and forth with the consultants, and they can provide us the answers. After that part of the agenda is over, we'll move to the question period. There are a number of people that have registered. I will quarterback that particular part of the process. We'll do the best we can to answer those questions. Some of them may have to be referred and answered at some point in time, depending on the nature of the question. But in one way or the other, we will get all of the answers. And so that is the way we're going to proceed. I hope everybody is comfortable with that. And so, having said that, Nick, I will put it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, members of council, for having us today to talk about cannabis issues and how we should be planning for cannabis moving forward. With me today are a few people. One is Alison Luoma. If she can turn on her camera, that would be great. She works for Meridian Planning Consultants and will be giving the bulk of the presentation. She was the primary author of the report, along with myself, and she's also a registered professional planner. In addition, Phil Gerard is with us today as well. He is the principal of a firm, PG Compliance Limited, who prepared a technical report under our supervision for this particular project, and he brought along with them Mr. Louis Dam, who knows quite a bit about cannabis growing and the growing of basically many things. So he is here as well, along with Phil, to answer any technical questions that anyone may have respecting this issue. I'm going to start off with I guess with a few statements before I hand it over to Alison regarding what we're now recommending. As council will recall, we were initially retained a couple of years ago to provide advice to the township on an appropriate approach to cannabis processing and cultivation. And essentially, in a nutshell, we recommended that indoor cannabis cultivation and processing in greenhouses not be permitted as of right anywhere in the township because of the many concerns that have been expressed in other jurisdictions about the odor emanating from these facilities. And essentially, we suggested, and council agreed, that there be no as of right permission, and that the County of Peterborough official plan should be amended to include some specific policies and direction that would allow you to make an informed decision if an indoor cannabis grower came to town and wished to establish an operation. With respect to outdoor cultivation, our recommendation at the time was that there be a 50-meter setback for outdoor cultivation from all lot lines. And that's what we recommended, and that's what was included in a zoning bylaw amendment passed by council 2 Januaries ago. Since that time, we have become much more aware of many of the issues surrounding cannabis cultivation across Ontario. And with the benefit of experience and perhaps some hindsight, we are now recommending that that setback be increased from 50 to 300 meters, which in our opinion represents an appropriate setback for outdoor cultivation. It may still be too little in some circumstances, depending on context, but we think the 300-meter setback, being that it is based on best practices, is defensible and supportable. So we are essentially coming back and changing our recommendation. Now, I fully realize and understand that since we made our last recommendation, someone has come forward with an application to, I guess, establish an outdoor cultivation operation in accordance with that previous setback. It is what it is, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions on that, and I'm sure there'll be discussion on that point. But the township, as a consequence of that particular application, did reach out to us to ask us if we wanted to look at that issue again and if our recommendations would be any different. So that's exactly what we've done. And we do now believe that the 300-meter setback is much more appropriate. To support that, we prepared a report that was circulated to you. Attached to that report is the report done by Phil Girard and Louis Dam. So we wanted to make sure that we had the technical basis to make these recommendations to you, and we believe that we have. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Allison, who's going to take us through the PowerPoint presentation, and then we can open it up for any questions you may have regarding our recommendations and how you wish to proceed. Allison?
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. I hope everybody's well. I think maybe at this point we'll just jump right into the presentation. So if we could have that up on the screen for the first page. There we go. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the report that we did was to do a number of things. The first one was to look at some of the primary impacts of cannabis cultivation, which in particular odor is number one. So we wanted to look at that and describe why cannabis odor from cultivation is a concern, particularly in proximity of sensitive land uses. And throughout this presentation, when we talk about sensitive land uses, we're primarily talking about community uses and residential uses that are within the community. We looked at best practices for managing the impacts of both indoor and outdoor cultivation of cannabis. And we wanted to look at what recommendations could come out of that best practices review that could go into the township zoning bylaw in order that the township can better regulate cannabis cultivation. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to be very specific here. This report is providing recommendations for commercially licensed cannabis operations that require a license from the federal government. This report really does not address cultivation for personal use or designated growers that comes under some of the earlier legislation from the federal government. Next slide, please. So cannabis, I think the first thing we'll do is look at how it's grown. I mean, it's primarily grown in three different ways. There's the outdoor growing of cannabis, which is field crops, and hoop houses are included within that category. Hoop houses, for those of you who are not familiar with them, are really just temporary greenhouses. They are not a contained environment. They are open to the outside elements, and they really just provide some shelter in terms of wind and perhaps hail, those sorts of elements, but very much still an outdoor structure for the growing of the cannabis crops. Indoor cannabis operations include greenhouses, and there are many warehouse type buildings. Most of these are occurring in industrial and employment areas. So I'm not sure how much of this you would see in Selwyn, but those are the three mediums through which cannabis is primarily grown. Next slide, please. So in looking at the growing of cannabis as field crops, first off, in recognizing that those crops are significantly influenced by climate, weather, topography, in particular microclimate. It is very common for the use of hoop houses, and these This particular means of growing cannabis poses a particular challenge because conventional pollution controls really can't readily be applied. And by conventional pollution controls, what I'm talking about is mitigative technical or technological measures that would be put onto a greenhouse to treat the air before it's exhausted. So really for outdoor operations, cannabis can really only be managed in terms of those impacts through separation distances between the cannabis operation and those sensitive land uses. Next slide, please. So greenhouses primarily occur within the agricultural and rural zones. To the right hand of your screen there, these are some greenhouses that are down in southwestern Ontario. As you can see, these can be absolutely huge enterprises. Although they do use natural light as a source of growing, they do require a lot of artificial climate controls, in particular, such as light. In order to have a year-round growing season, artificial light must be provided for some of those shorter light days in the year, and cooling systems must be implemented to control the temperature and humidities as well within those greenhouses. Greenhouses in particular can have significant light impacts. I would say light is up there with the odor impacts in terms of surrounding land uses, and the light impacts can be seen from quite a distance. Greenhouses can exhaust significant amounts of air, and they need to do so in order to control the temperature and humidity. And the degree to which those air treatment control systems are effective in many respects depends on the type of structure that those systems are needed in, whether it's a retrofit to an existing building or whether it's a purpose-built greenhouse specifically for cannabis. Next slide, please. Cannabis is also grown in warehouses. And so again, we have some pictures there to the left. These, again, primarily occur in employment areas, although they can be in agricultural and rural areas also. They are different from greenhouses in that they are completely sealed from any outdoor impacts, elements, I shall say. So there's no natural light. Air temperature and humidity is completely controlled and recirculated within the building. And those pictures there to the left also show that. You can see that it's the artificial light and it's a solid roof structure. Given that it is such a controlled environment, the amount of air that is exhausted out of these facilities is more easily mitigated and more easily controlled. Next slide, please. So in looking at this, this picture here on the right, the first thing I want to point out to you, this is light that is coming from a greenhouse cannabis operation. The purple light is cannabis. The orange light off to the side, I don't recall exactly what that is, but that is another greenhouse type crop that was being built in this area. This is down in Leamington. But as you can see, that light pollution into the dark sky comes from quite a distance away and has quite an impact. So light has been identified very much as an issue. So while the federal government has put in place various requirements for odor controls, there have been varying levels of success with that, as with the light pollution. As a result, many municipalities have passed bylaws relying on separation distances in order to try and mitigate these impacts. And what we found in our best practice review was there was anywhere between 150 and 500 meters between cannabis facilities and sensitive land uses, depending on the municipality and depending on the circumstances of individual greenhouses. Next slide, please. So the province has a well-documented past in terms of recognizing the value of separating incompatible land uses. And in an agricultural context, that is well established through the MDS. MDS relies specifically on separation distances to mitigate odor impacts. And in this case, it's between agricultural uses with livestock operations and, again, sensitive land uses. And they rely on the same type of concept in terms of industrial uses, where they have the land use compatibility D6 guidelines that they rely on to put some kind of separation distance in between industrial uses and sensitive land uses, depending on the type of or class of industrial use that's in question. So in terms of a construct and a way to mitigate some of these impacts, this is a very common concept. Unfortunately, there is no parallel for agricultural crops. Cannabis is fairly unique in that this is really the first time that in Ontario we've come across this, where a crop actually produces odors that are really quite problematic. It is very different from things like corn or soybeans or other crops that are grown. So this is why, in light of this, because there is really no provincial guidance in terms of similar to MDS currently, municipalities are not permitting indoor cannabis cultivation operations as of right. And that is particularly so that municipalities can give some scrutiny to what is being applied for. They can ask for studies, and they can custom tailor the response in terms of the mitigative measures, in terms of the setbacks and the separation distances that may be required. And at this point here, maybe what I'll do is I'll just be very specific in the terminology we're using. So in terms of a minimum separation distance, that is exactly what it sounds like. It's that separation distance between two uses. And when we're using the word setback, that is as we customarily would be using it in zoning in terms of setbacks from a lot line. So just to be clear on the terminology that's in the presentation moving forward. Next slide, please. So in terms of establishing setback distances, separation distances, there are a number of factors that have to be considered, and which is why it makes it very difficult to permit these types of facilities as of right. It depends on whether the facility is a greenhouse or an industrial type warehouse building, if the greenhouse is purpose built, or if it's a retrofit from an earlier type greenhouse, a vegetable greenhouse, for example, the size and scale of the facility, how many sensitive land uses are within the area and the nature of them, the location of the proposed facility as it relates to some of those microclimate issues that we mentioned earlier in terms of prevailing winds in particular, which in Ontario generally is from the west/northwest, blowing eastwards. And the nature of the adverse effects that exist already within the area, because there are still cumulative impacts there, depending on what other types of operations are nearby. For example, potentially a chicken farm or a pig farm. There may be cumulative impacts there. And then the type of topography in terms of how things are dispersed. And this is especially relevant where if you have low-lying areas, you have valley lands or you have wetlands or something that is a little bit more conducive to a fog effect, that can allow the odor to linger longer, and it takes a little bit longer for that to dissipate. So some of that topography also impacts the speed with which that odor passes through an area. Next slide, please. So the provincial policy statement, it has indicated that the province has indicated that cultivation of cannabis is an agricultural use, and it is permitted in agricultural areas by the PPS. In particular, the province has given indications that the outdoor growing of cannabis, so example fields, is no different than any other agricultural crop, and that it should be handled in much the same way that a cornfield would be, or soybeans or any other type of agricultural crop. However, in absence of any guidelines on odor, the province is not opposing requiring a rezoning for indoor cultivation facilities in agricultural areas. So while they are very permissive with those outdoor crops as of right, they are recognizing that there is a need to control some of the impacts or more concentrated impacts potentially from greenhouses and indoor operations, and they are accepting that they may only be permitted by amendment at the local level. Next slide, please. So in terms of the official plan, this is really just a summary of what exists in the current official plan as a result of OPA 58. Nick summarized most of this, so I don't think I'll spend too long on this. In Selwyn, the OPA specifies that indoor cultivation is only permitted by way of a zoning bylaw amendment. It has also provided that there's a 50-meter setback from lot lines. Next slide, please. And the OP policies provide a number of criteria that when a zoning bylaw amendment application is submitted for an indoor cannabis use, there are a number of criteria which council and staff at the municipality should consider in terms of determining the suitability for what's being applied for, as well as what kind of mitigative remedies might be required. Next slide, please. The zoning bylaw, again, Nick has touched on this. But again, a zoning bylaw amendment and site plan control are both required. The zoning bylaw carries forward the 50-meter setback from the lot line. And the only thing that I would be sure to flag here is that where the 150-meter setback from adjacent land uses and where the 50-meter setback from the lot line is specified in the current OP and zoning, I would flag that these are minimums. And the terminology in those planning documents is that it is a minimum 50 meters and a minimum 150 meters. So the township, when these applications come forward, and if studies are done or submitted in support of these applications, the township fully has at its disposal to increase those distances if they think that that's appropriate. Next slide, please. So again, the zoning, it's specifying a minimum separation distance of 150 meters, and it specifies, as opposed to just saying sensitive land uses, it's very specific in terms of what uses that 150 meter separation distance applies to. Next slide, please. So in doing our work, as Nick has mentioned, we were lucky enough to have Phil and Louis join the team and look at the technical best practices associated with cannabis cultivation. What they're looking at here are some of the best practices related to the air treatment control, to the structures, and some of the remedies from that perspective, from more of an engineering perspective. So what some of the key findings of their report was that the most effective odor control is very much dependent on the specifics of the cannabis operation. Potential influence areas around a cannabis operation can vary greatly from 70 to 1,000 meters, depending on the individual conditions present. And in their report, they do identify 8 of the more common odor control technologies, and they do provide much more detail than we have here in this presentation as to some of the technical attributes of those various methods. Next slide, please. So the key recommendations coming out of their report was that they were supportive of a minimum separation distance of 500 meters. They did specifically say that any application for a cannabis operation should include both an odor impact study, so that will look at all of those salient influences to odor, as well as an odor management plan that will detail how any odor generated will be managed on the site, how the various equipment will be validated, and how on an ongoing basis that will continue to be addressed. They have also asked or suggested that there be a written opinion from a professional engineer stating that the odor from the cannabis cultivation operation will not adversely impact sensitive receptors or sensitive land uses, which essentially that would come out of the odor impact study and management plan that would be done by an engineer who specialized in that sort of thing, as Mr. Gerard does. So that would come out of that study. Next slide, please. And then finally, they recommended that the owner-operator of a cannabis operation provide to the Township of Selwyn a signed commitment or agreement that in the event of a substantiated odor complaint attributed to the cannabis cultivation, that the owner-operator agrees to implement additional odor controls to mitigate the odor that is occurring. Next slide, please. So in terms of best practices, we look at, I'm looking at 4 different categories here. We have separation, distances and setbacks. We have mitigation measures. We have security that we looked at, and then we have some other recommendations that council may wish to consider that we did come across in other municipalities. And depending on the level that council wishes to regulate this activity, we can entertain some of those items in the zoning as well. But in terms of the separation distances and setbacks, all of the municipalities that we reviewed have put in place a minimum separation distance between cannabis operations and sensitive land uses. These separation distances range from between 70 to 300 meters. However, the most prevalent that we found, and I will say overwhelmingly, is that for indoor operations, it is a minimum setback of 150 meters, whereas for outdoor operations, it is a minimum setback of 300 meters. We have also come across the scenarios in municipalities where in earlier versions of their zoning, they had set up 150 meters and they've now had to extend that to 300 meters for outdoor facilities. Buildings associated with cannabis operation can be set back enhanced distances from the property line. So while you may have the minimum separation distance between the cannabis operation and the use, that can be augmented, or collectively that can be managed through the setbacks from lot lines. In many of the municipalities we looked at, that ranged from 20 to 80 meters. Again, it depended on the individual circumstance, whether it was a side, front, or rear lot line. And you can also enhance that further by increasing the minimum lot area that's required, or the minimum lot size, in order to accommodate a cannabis operation. So if you have a larger lot size in the cannabis operation, it gives you more space in which to apply those setbacks. Next slide, please. So in terms of managing impacts, there were another number of impacts that we looked at. A lot of them are related to things like light, noise, and odor, which commonly are grouped together and identified as nuisance impacts. We have found zoning provisions in other municipalities that require that any lighting that is associated with the cannabis facility be designed to be energy efficient, be directed downwards, and located or arranged to deflect glare away from adjacent residential uses and the night sky. And at this point, I think I would also highlight that while you may have these zoning provisions in your bylaw requiring this, it very much works hand in hand with site plan control, because it's at that site plan level where the municipality receives drawings and the discussion as to where is that lighting, how is it pointed, where is it going to be directed away from. That a lot of those discussions happen at the site plan level. Some municipalities have also required that a screening or a land planting or landscape buffer or strip be provided along lot lines. I would just point out that that obviously cannabis would not be considered a landscape buffer in this regard, and that this vegetative planting strip can be a prescribed width. So the particular example that we had of this, it was a 3-meter wide buffer that they required. And again, at the site plan level, you can be very specific with what that looks like. Next slide, please. All municipalities prohibited outdoor storage associated with cannabis operations very specifically, especially in the instance where sometimes outdoor storage is associated with an agricultural use. You want to be very clear that although cannabis operations are recognized as being an agricultural use, that outdoor storage, for obvious, security reasons and so on, as well as the odor, are not permitted. Only one cannabis operation to be permitted on a single conveyable lot. And in terms of the removal of waste cannabis byproduct, we literally did not find any municipality that dealt with this through zoning. However, I think the remedy here would be that can be addressed through the requirements of a complete application. So in the official plan, there is a list of all of the various studies that may be required to support an application that is submitted. And through the studies that are requested, that would be one area that the municipality could rely upon to address this waste cannabis byproduct through a waste study. Next slide, please. So we did specifically look at this in terms of what sort of studies are required in other municipalities. And so this is just a list here. Environmental impact study, which can address things like surface water, groundwater. This can address the amount of water that is required for the cannabis operation, as well as what happens with the wastewater. A hydrogeological study, servicing study, also to look at stormwater as well. An odor study and associated management plan, lighting study, noise study, and your waste management plan. Next slide, please. So the third area of best practices was security. Some of this would seem fairly obvious, but many municipalities and certainly cannabis operations have small security huts associated with the operation, especially the larger ones. And many municipalities are being very explicit in their zoning bylaws to say that these little security huts, they may be permitted in any of the required yards, and they are not subject to the normal required yard setback. Whether it be the front yard or any other yard. But in particular, in most municipalities, the accessory buildings that can be put in a front yard is usually fairly limited. And this is expressly waiving that. Security fencing, we have seen zoning provisions requiring security fencing, although I would like to point out that this is required as part of their federal license. So this is really more of a reinforcement of something as opposed to requiring something new. And then finally, that loading spaces be within wholly enclosed buildings. Next slide, please. So in terms of, we looked at, that's all of our best practices, and we looked at all of that, and we came forward with some key recommendations, but there was an underlying principle for the recommendations that we made. And as a first principle, the avoidance of an adverse impact is preferred. And avoidance, quite frankly, translates into a minimum distance separation in this effect. However, if avoidance is not possible, then the adverse effects must be minimized to the greatest degree possible and appropriately mitigated. And much of that is what happens on the actual property or the lot that contains the cannabis operation, whether that's their air treatment control mechanisms, or whether that is setbacks off lot lines, or if that is restrictions on outdoor storage. Those are all designed to minimize and mitigate impacts. Next slide, please. So in terms of our recommendations, we're recommending 300 meters from a separation distance of 300 meters from sensitive land uses. And again, we've specified what sorts of things are included there. We do recognize that this number is somewhat different than what came out of the PG reports, and Nick has addressed that earlier in the presentation. There were really two primary reasons that we felt comfortable with this 300 number, this 300 distance. One is that indoor cannabis cultivation and processing is only going to be permitted by amendment to the zoning bylaw. So that means that for every single indoor cannabis cultivation application, there will be a customized set of zoning requirements that will apply to it. And that will include everything from setbacks from lot lines to the size of the facility, to lot coverage. They will be completely site specific. In terms of what we're seeing across the province, we know that the 300 meters, there is a solid precedent for that. And Nick could potentially speak more to this in the Q&A as to what we're finding at the LPAT. But in terms of something being defendable, we know that we are on solid, strong ground with that 300. And again, I would point out that that 300, especially as written in the planning documents, being the zoning bylaw in particular, that 300 is being posed as a minimum. So that's the very least amount of separation distance that would be required. Again, the township is always at liberty to require a greater separation distance if they felt that that was appropriate. Next slide, please. So these are some of our recommended zone regulations for cannabis cultivation in the agricultural and rural zones. Where these would appear would be in the general provisions section of your bylaw. So this is where you would have some very use-specific requirements, similar to the way you do now for kennels or for home occupations. So the language is something to the effect of, where an indoor cannabis cultivation facility is permitted, the following shall apply. So we're recommending a minimum lot area of 10 hectares, minimum lot frontage of 200 meters. And then you can see there that that we've recommended varying of the required yard setbacks. Again, on very solid ground with these. We've seen these numbers elsewhere, so we're very comfortable carrying these forward. Outdoor cannabis cultivation should continue to be subject to the standard zone requirements of the agricultural and rural zones. Again, they are viewed as a crop similar to any other agricultural crop. Next slide, please. So these are some of our additional recommendations that don't fit into a nice, neat little box, but only one cannabis operation on a single conveyable lot. We do recommend the zoning provision to control the lighting. We do recommend the vegetated buffers, prohibiting outdoor storage, and continue to require that cannabis operations be subject to site plan control, which they already are. Next slide, please. So these are some interesting zoning provisions that we came across. They are something that council can consider. It really depends on the degree to which council wants to regulate these things. So we talked about this before, permitting a building or structure used for security purposes to locate in any yard. Require that only new purpose-built facilities are permitted for cannabis operations, that any conversion or retrofit of existing agricultural buildings or structures is prohibited. Phil can speak more directly to this in terms of the challenges and how effectively the odor can be controlled in a retrofit building. It's very different, especially with the shorter ceiling heights in a typical greenhouse that was not built for cannabis, and how that impacts air circulation and what has to be done in terms of exhaust to be able to manage that indoor climate for the crop. So some municipalities have actually said that cannabis operations can only occur in new purpose-built facilities for all of those reasons. Require that indoor cannabis facilities, including greenhouses, be equipped with a mandatory air treatment control system. Again, I'd point out this is actually a requirement of the federal license, although we did come across a number of municipalities that actually have a zoning provision specifically requiring this, and then they actually add a definition for an air treatment control system in the zoning bylaw as well. And then finally, we did see one or two municipalities that specify that any amendments to the applicable zoning regulations for cannabis may only occur by way of a zoning bylaw amendment to be heard by council or planning committee, and that specifically such requests may not be addressed through minor variance. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps from here, once we have our meeting and we answer questions and we're ready to move forward, we would suggest that a draft zoning bylaw be prepared based on the recommendations in the report and any input received from council today. We would then move to a public meeting to consider that zoning bylaw amendments, and then ultimately we would bring back that final draft zoning bylaw for council's approval. Next slide, please. So that is the end of the presentation. We welcome questions and answers. We have the full team here. There's Nick, myself, Phil, and Louis available to step in and help out. And I guess we'll hand it back over to council for questions.
Thank you very much, Allison. Just before I move on, just a couple of points. So as I said, I'm going to go to my fellow councillors. And after we have that discussion from fellow councillors, I don't know whether they will have a motion to put forward, but I'll ask them if they do to wait until all of the council members have a chance to do their Q&A. But just before I turn it over, because I want to make sure I heard something correctly. Allison, if you could go back to slide 14. In your discussion, and I want to make sure I heard you correctly, you made reference to the 50-meter setback and the 150-meter setback as being minimums as they exist in the current bylaw, and that we could alter those minimums. Did I hear you correctly?
You did, yes. So the actual language in the zoning right now is that it is a minimum of 50. Sorry, I have the zoning in front of me here. That it is outdoor shall be set back a minimum of 50 meters from a lot line. And it is similar wording here. So for indoor, it's indoor and cannabis processing facilities are required to be set back a minimum, a minimum of 150 meters from the lot line. So those are minimums, and the township is completely at liberty to expand those distances if they feel appropriate.
On any application covered by that. Rob, are you on the line?
If I can supplement what Allison just said, not to disagree with my own staff, but if something is permitted as of right in a zoning bylaw, the minimum is the minimum, and the township is not able to ask for anything in excess. If there is a general provision that says a use has to be set back a certain amount and somebody has to get a rezoning to actually permit that use on a property, then you're able to ask for a greater number based on whatever studies were submitted in support of the application. Similarly, I'll give you a similar example. Your bylaw has minimum yards, front, side, and rear, and that side yard is 1.2 meters. That's what the building official is obligated to issue a permit on if that application is made. So just to make that very clear, for a use that's permitted as of right, the minimum ends up being the minimum.
So it's 50. Okay, I'm glad you clarified that because I could see the consternation on the faces of some of my colleagues. So, okay, thank you for clarifying that. We will go to Donna.
Thank you very much. Through you, I have many questions, but I'll try and limit them to a few. As you probably know, we're in a big mess with a property which is abuts residential areas. And from what I can understand from this presentation, that, well, first of all, the operator, which is, it's an outdoor operation, he can go by our previous bylaw, but I'm wondering if the air quality becomes untenable, if water quality or quantity is impacted, what recourse do we have if this occurs in the middle of the growing season?
So I take it that's probably for us to address that question. When a use is permitted as of right, it basically is permitted as of right. And there is no permit required from the township for the growing of a crop. So it's not like they have to make an application. If somebody wanted to plant corn or soybeans, they just go off and do it. What the current bylaw says is that the edge of that crop has to be 50 meters away. As with any other agricultural use, they have to ensure that whatever they're doing constitutes normal farm practices. And if there are any issues with respect to someone farming their land not being considered a normal farm practice, then the recourse is to and I'm not really sure how the process exactly works, but there's actually a normal farm practices board that would deal with that kind of issue. It's completely outside of the jurisdiction of the township. The license is issued by the federal government with basically no municipal oversight. It is the system we have, unfortunately, that is in place. I'm not sure if Louis or Phil have anything else to add on the normal farm practices angle. If not, that's fine. But if they do, please put your hand up, and if you can expand on my answer.
This is Louis Dam here. I can add to what Nick just said. You know, when we have a situation with an outdoor crop that is too close to residential or any other sensitive use, but in particular residential, the operator of that outdoor crop also has to recognize that they are at risk with their crop from whatever the neighbors do. So it's a double-edged sword. If we have somebody that's, you know, a certified organic grower and, you know, they're farming and they're using their best practices for organic farming, and somehow what the cannabis producer is doing does not fit with organic farming or vice versa, we have two operations that are at risk. So there needs to be due diligence as to, you know, who are the neighbors and what are the neighbors, because this is predominantly, you know, this is why we have the normal farm practices board, because it's also to help farmers with, you know, solving disputes with issues between each one of them.
So that's just between farmers. That's not between farmers and residents?
Well, if the normal farm practices board with cannabis, I think is being, you know, by cannabis operations in general, is being misinterpreted as to, you know, what it really is. There's a whole mediation process that goes on with with the problem and coming to a resolution of the problem. It's not a code of law. There is a complete review. There are situations where cannabis operations are trying to bypass the normal farm practices board and have a judge state that it's actually what they are doing is considered a normal farm practice. So, you know, the whole normal farm practices issue that's a big can. There's a lot of subjects in there.
But just to stress, to answer your question more directly, anyone can make a complaint. So it's not limited to farmers. Rural residents and neighbors can also make complaints. I guess what Louis was reflecting upon is that once that complaint is made, there are many paths that complaint can go, and you know, so that there's no guarantee at the end of the day.
So here as an example, here in the Niagara region, where Phil and I reside, you know, in Lincoln and Niagara-on-the-Lake, every year, you know, urban expansion is aggressive. But the new folks that come into town discover that, you know, in the fall, we've got this banging going on. I mean, the grape producers literally have bird bangers. And, you know, that is a normal farm practice. But what's not a normal farm practice with bird bangers is if the farmer is overusing them based on, you know, the cycles of when they go off. For example, if a farmer's using it, it's going off every 30 seconds, that's not a normal farm practice. If it's going off every 4 minutes, that may be considered a normal farm practice.
I'll go on with a few other things. This is a comment, first of all. When we do our bylaw, I would recommend that we have one whole part of the bylaw for indoor growing rules and another whole part for outdoor, because this presentation is flipping back and forth from indoor to outdoor, and it's really hard to keep straight what can be done with an indoor grow operation and an outdoor one. So I guess that's a criticism. And then the technical best practices, the key recommendations, it says application for cannabis operation should include odor impact study, how equipment will be maintained, et cetera, but I assume that's for an indoor operation, not an outdoor. Is that correct? Because we don't get those applications. So, and then the signed commitment to mitigate odor from the owner to the municipality. So can any of that be done for us, for outdoor grow operations?
The simple answer, Councillor, is no, because the outdoor growing of cannabis is permitted as of right, and there is no permit required by the municipality for that use. I suppose council would be very happy if we were able to recommend to you that outdoor cultivation be prohibited, as we're recommending for indoor cultivation. However, we don't believe that would be defensible, and that would be struck down, in our opinion, by the local planning appeals tribunal because it's an agricultural crop. It's an unfortunate issue with respect to outdoor, and in my opinion, the best we can do is establish a generous setback for outdoor cultivation, and I guess hope for the best based on that setback being appropriate. But restricting someone from planting a crop is going way beyond, in my opinion, what I think a municipality can do through a zoning bylaw.
And I'll just make one more point. I have a lot, but is there properties that we can identify in the municipality that are fairly small rural or agricultural properties that we can actually say that, and I think the answer is no as well, that cannabis cannot be grown on that, like this particular property, which I think is 40 or 45 acres surrounded by houses. Is there any way that we can do that in our municipality, is point out certain properties that would not be able to be planted?
I think the simple answer is no. We have not run into that restriction in any of the other municipalities we've looked at. Instead, the 300 meter separation distance is the best way to go because that works on any property. And if a property was bordered with houses on both sides of it that were 200 meters of, from the property, then automatically it knocks out that property. However, there may be smaller properties that work because the homes are set back quite a distance away. So it would not be possible to pre-identify that in advance.
I'll let it go for now and have my colleagues make questions or comments.
Thank you very much.
If I might just jump in there for 1 second.
Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Thank you. Phil Gerard from PG Compliance Management. Just to follow up on that comment, Donna, while the town may not have the ability to say that you can or can't grow these crops in these locations, through historic meteorological data, we would know which sites will be more problematic than others based on history repeating in meteorological terms. So, for example, as Allison said at the beginning, there's certain prevailing winds in certain areas and microclimates that are created. So you would know probably in advance that this would represent a better site than other sites might be. And some sites will just be particularly problematic.
But we still couldn't say you're not allowed to plant a crop there.
I think that's what Nick and everyone else is saying, that it wouldn't be within your right.
It's very depressing.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, so if I can just chime in really quickly, Mr. Chair.
Yeah,
So I guess to Nick's point, as it relates to say something like 290 core, the setbacks that are being proposed in this particular zoning bylaw would effectively sterilize properties of that ilk, right? Surrounded by dwellings on either side of the road, right? So that's how you would address dealing with smaller properties that are in close proximity to residences. These setbacks would have a significant impact on the arable land that's left for development. Right?
Thanks, Rob. Sherry is just taking a quick, there she is. Oh, we lost you there, Sherry. Go ahead.
Sorry, my window was open and somebody's doing some kind of making a lot of racket, so I had to shut the window. Sorry.
Welcome to the COVID world.
Thank you. Through you, I concur with the recommendations that have been brought forward so far, and I might be asking the same question only differently and maybe hoping for a different answer. But is there any ability of the new rules that we are looking at establishing being retroactive for the existing property that it has cannabis that's going to be grown there?
I think the simple answer is no. And I think Mr. Lamar would have probably told you, that, I believe he's already told you the same thing. Zoning bylaws are only effective on the date that they're passed. If they're appealed, then it even takes longer for a zoning bylaw to come into effect, but they cannot be retroactive.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And does medical marijuana licenses apply here?
So again, that's a very good question. We've done some thinking on it. We can't give you a definitive answer only because they are not subject to the same rules as commercial growers are. And there are a number of folks who are taking advantage of the rules and accumulating through various means multiple licenses. And the most that I've seen one person being able to grow is like up to 285 plants. That's for 4 people, but then that person figures out a way to become a designated grower for sometimes dozens or even hundreds of other people, and they just start growing it. In my view, and I'm not a lawyer, it does appear to be offside with the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regulations that apply, and it becomes an enforcement issue. And it is a very challenging issue. Health Canada is currently in the process of rewriting some of those rules and are looking to close some of those loopholes. But it is very, very challenging for a municipality to even control these things if they don't even know where they are in the first place. And they often only become known when they see increased activity at a property, and oftentimes criminals end up being part of these operations. And there are different people in the area. A complaint gets made, the police have to go in and do a search warrant and figure out if something is actually happening that is against the law. That's the current state of it, unfortunately. And it is the rules the way they are. So our focus is on the commercial growers, which actually go through a process. They apply for a license in good faith. Health Canada looks at these license applications, works with them to make sure they get the best operation as a consequence. Some may argue they don't do a good enough job, and that's a fair comment, but that's the proper way to go through it. These other folks have found a loophole, unfortunately, and it's very difficult for municipalities to regulate that. I did suggest to Mr. Lamar in a previous call that there may be, if there's a desire to get a more definitive answer on that, that a legal opinion could be sought by the township on that particular issue in terms of the ability to enforce zoning when something is illegal to start off with. So that's where I'll stop because I'm not a lawyer.
Okay.
So, do you want to add something to that answer? Your hand's up.
Yes, thank you. Just to put things in perspective a little bit, when Health Canada was originally designing the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regulations, they did a study and they reviewed other papers. And at that point in time, the typical daily average prescription of cannabis was around 1 to 3 grams per day. And now, if you have enough money, you can go online and almost instantaneously get a prescription for 90 grams per day or higher. So what does that mean from a plant growing perspective? Using the government, Health Canada's own cannabis calculator, 1 to 3 grams per day equates to a personal consumption of around 15 plants grown inside. 95 grams per day equates to about 463 plants. So if you can combine 4 registrations under one roof, which you are allowed to do, you now have thousands of plants at a site. And I think they didn't anticipate that medical practitioners would be prescribing such vast amounts of cannabis to individuals. So it sort of highlights the real problem. And I think they've, as Nick mentioned, exploited some of the gray areas associated with the cannabis regulations.
Thanks, Phil.
I have one last question, Mr. Mayor. Would it be appropriate to include in your recommendations from a bylaw perspective, remediation of property if the property is abandoned? I've heard that there are some properties where people have gone in, grown it, and then gone, and it's left to the municipality to remediate.
My quick answer is I'm not sure. I do know municipalities pass property standards bylaws to deal with unsightly properties and properties that have been let go, so to speak. I've not heard of that being applied in an agricultural context where someone has let a field go. That does happen as a normal course. Farmers do leave fields fallow for sometimes lengthy periods to let the soil regenerate. So I'm not sure how you would start and stop in assessing that moving forward. So I don't think so. We're happy to take a quick look at that, but I don't think there's an ability, at least through a municipal zoning bylaw, to require remediation. A bylaw is a very simple tool. You can do something, yes, or you can't do something, no. If it's yes, here are the rules, and that's it. The only way you get remediation in a lot of cases is if there's a Planning Act process involved and you make somebody enter into an agreement, like a site plan agreement or a development agreement, and then you can get them to remediate. But that wouldn't be happening with agricultural cultivation, in my view.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherry. Anita.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Really, really informative. Obviously, some of the questions I had have already been asked. I just want to follow up on Donna's question. So, for instance, if a grower has issues with odor management or any other issues, if they're found to not be effective or compliant, can the townships shut the operation down?
Okay, so two parts of that question. For an indoor operation wants to set up shop in a municipality, you will have a meeting with them, or the township will have a meeting with them through the normal course of pre-consultation, identify the studies that will be needed to be done. This is all indoor, of course, and those studies get done. They're peer reviewed if required to make sure they're accurate. And then if council feels like they've done their homework and it's supportable, council says yes, but they require that person to enter into an agreement with the municipality, some kind of agreement. It's either site plan or a development agreement. And you can negotiate whatever you can negotiate in that agreement to make sure that they live with what they've actually proposed in their application materials. And if they don't, then that agreement can be enforced. So there's a lot that goes into that. Lawyers get involved sometimes, but that's how you would do that. Certainly with outdoor, because there is no agreement, there is no ability to deal with that issue at all. I can say that the other option available to the community or to the township would be to consider some type of an odor bylaw. It's an odorous nuisance bylaw. I'm not sure how that would apply to outdoor operations, but it is something that could be investigated by the township. I do know of one other community, the town of Pelham, that is looking very specifically, or has looked very specifically, at an odorous nuisances bylaw. So there is a template out there of sorts that could be looked at by the municipality. However, I'm not an expert in those kinds of bylaws, but I do know that they're out there.
And this is a question for staff. Rob, have you had any other applications, whether it's for outdoor cultivation or inquiries about indoor cultivation and processing, other than the one that on Cork?
Yes, Mr. Chair, yes, I did speak with, I've spoken with one individual about a potential indoor operation, small scale. This was during the time that we had our interim control bylaw. So we simply let him know that, of course, we couldn't consider it at the time that he was inquiring, but that he could check back once we had developed our zoning bylaw regulations, and I haven't heard from him since. And we've also spoken to a few different people, existing landowners, farmers, who are exploring the notion of considering, an outdoor crop, and we've simply let them know what the rules are today, and so that they could make an informed decision as to whether or not to make application to the federal government. But we've not been advised of any applications yet made to the federal licensing board. We anticipate, of course, that we will see one for 290 Cork at some point, but we haven't seen it either.
So just as a follow-up then, so the ones you were talking about on farm properties, would they be under the existing 50-meter setback, or would we hold off until the 300-meter setback?
Yeah, again, through you, Mr. Chair, yeah, if they made application to the federal government, so the way it works is before they can make application to the federal government for their license, they have to develop the site sufficiently to meet the federal licensing criteria, right? So that's why if you were to drive by to 290 Cork, you'd see that there's a 6-foot fence with a barbed wire on it, that they're starting to wire for lighting, and they're doing what is required of them through the federal licensing program. And until they've met those criteria, I don't believe they would obtain a license, right? So if somebody were to contact me, obviously aside from the 290 Cork people, we would inform them of what the rules are today, and those are the rules that we would apply, and they would presumably, if they were serious about it, begin to make whatever improvements to their property that are necessary for them to comply with their licensing criteria.
Okay, thank you, Anita. I'm going to take a few minutes here, colleagues, and I want to explore some of the stuff that you've already raised, but I'm going to address this to Nick to begin with. And I get that circumstances change, and I get that knowledge evolves over time. But I think that it's I'm sure that you appreciate that as counselors, we don't have the kind of in-depth knowledge that either consultants do or some of our professional staff do. We have to depend on advice. And the reality is the advice that we received a mere 18 months ago is substantially different than the advice that we're getting today. And that is let me just say it's a bit challenging. And I just wanted to say that I'm not questioning. I know you're doing your best, and you're trying to give us the best advice, but I'm sure you appreciate that in a very short period of time, we're being given not opposing, but very different advice. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, Nick, or just it is what it is.
Well, to a certain extent, it is what it is. Certainly, we build our base of knowledge as land use planners as we gain new experiences, and that's what you're seeing today. At the time we were retained to complete the work, we certainly did a canvas of best practices. We weren't aware of this being a significant issue. The real focus was on indoor. And we checked literature, we looked at literature, and we did not come across any reported circumstances of there being conflicts from outdoor cultivation. It was only when we became involved in another municipality, did another scan of best practices, that it was becoming much more apparent particularly in southern Ontario, south of Peterborough area, in the Niagara Peninsula, Norfolk County, and so on, that there were concerns about outdoor cropping as well. Now, the concerns are a little different. It is outdoors. There aren't as, the odor really only happens when the plants are flowering, so it's not at all times. But be that as it may, we learn all the time. And when we were contacted again to provide advice to see if the numbers were right, as I told Mr. Lamar, we could have said no, we don't want to help you because we know that our recommendation is going to be different. But I felt that it was necessary for us to give you our best foot forward and our best advice possible, and we've endeavored to do that.
Okay, let me just try to explore a couple of the recommendations, because I want to make sure I understand them correctly. So first of all, there were really three different amounts or distances that were laid out in the various reports. So the 300 meter, which is your recommendation, there was a 500 meter, which I think sort of was Phil's recommendation. It's the way I'm reading his report. And then also in that technical report, there was a reference to odor traveling a couple of kilometers. So I'm just, and I don't know who wants to take it. I want to feel some comfort as to why it's your best advice that it's 300 meters, not 500 meters, and not 2 kilometers. I think it said 2 kilometers. It might have just said kilometers plural. My apologies if I'm not getting it right. Nick, did you want to answer that?
Great. Okay, great question. And I'm going to ask Phil to discuss his thoughts from a technical perspective, and I'll have him do that in a moment. The basis for the 300 is that I'm giving you a land use planning opinion on what is defensible at an LPAT hearing. And I believe 300 is defensible. I think 500 is overly conservative for outdoor cultivation. That's my personal view. There's nothing that prevents this council from directing staff to put 500 in the bylaw. But I wouldn't be able to defend it at an LPAT hearing if you did that. But that's within council's, bailiwick, so to speak, to do that. The 2 kilometer reference is a reference to a real worst case scenario, in my view, of where you have a fairly significant operation along with a combination of prevailing winds, certain types of topography, and so on, all combining to create a circumstance which has existed where you would notice odors from a 2 kilometer distance. And in my view, I don't think you experience that odor impact from outdoor, but I'll ask Phil for that. And you're protected from these more significant impacts because the indoor operations are not being permitted as of right, and you are able to judge them on a case-by-case basis. And they may do studies that say, well, the worst case is 500 meters. You do a peer review that says the worst case is 1,000 meters, and you fight it out, basically. But you're protected because you're not permitting the use as of right. And there's a study process that ensues that allows that to be studied. I don't believe the 2 kilometers would be an issue with outdoor. But Phil, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I certainly can. So I've done fairly extensive sampling in Holland Marsh around outdoor cannabis facilities, and they don't have any indoor grows that I have been part of anyway, and my study experiences down there. What I found though is the outdoor grows have a much milder cannabis odor compared to indoor grow operations. And in my experience, I am finding odor impact 300 to 500 meters away from outdoor grow operations. But I find the odor to be quite fleeting. And as we all know, the odor meanders and moves around and so forth. However, if you were downwind of those, downwind in the prevailing wind direction, you would be impacted. You could be impacted a fair bit of time. So generally, outdoor grows have lower odor than the indoor grow operations. Speaking to the 2 kilometers, or I think it might have been me that referenced that number in my report. And so that's based on sampling that I've conducted at an indoor grow operation, a large licensed producer. So this wasn't a small mom and pop operation. This was substantial. And they had hundreds of exhaust fans around the property. And I sampled, I don't know, I think it was around 75 exhaust fans, plugged them into an atmospheric dispersion model. And even though this facility is supposedly, well, it is federally licensed, and there's a prohibition against the release of odor, the dispersion modeling shows the impact going out kilometers from the facility, where a person with a normal sense of smell would be able to detect the odors from that facility. And so there's one of the problems with the federal legislation, prohibits the release of odor, but in practice, it's exceptionally difficult to achieve that. And Louis can speak to that as well. And we're seeing that down in our neck of the woods, where we have multiple community impact reports around some of these large facilities. So the kilometers is based on actual experience and dispersion modeling and sampling that I've conducted at them. My 500-meter recommendation is based on largely using the Ministry of the Environment's land use planning guidance, following the same procedures. And I guess it's important to note that my modeling and my experience shows that the impact can be kilometers away. And that's why I recommend that it's essential for an indoor operation to have that odor study that shows that their controls will be put in place, that we will prove the effectiveness of the facility, effectiveness of the controls when the facility is commissioned, and then have that ongoing monitoring program to ensure that the residents are protected thereafter. And in the event of complaints, it's necessary for them to have an odor mitigation plan sitting in the background, so that additional mitigation will be immediately implemented upon substantiated complaints.
I appreciate you clarifying that, because it's primarily what you're saying is for indoor operations, not outdoor operations. So that's clarity. So I next want to try to understand how that, I'm going to use the 300-meter number for argument's sake, would work. So you're trying to replicate an MDS. So let's assume we had a 100-acre square plot of land, and at one end of it there was residential. On the other 3 sides there was more not unoccupied, but agricultural land with no sensitive land use. So the sensitive land use was only in one end. So what you're suggesting is there would be 300 meters at that one end where you would move back. You're not suggesting that you would have a 300-meter setback on all 4 sides of that property, just on the side of the property that would be near the sensitive land use. Am I understanding that correctly? You're muted, Nick.
Sorry about that. To make this 100% clear, it is a setback between the edge of the cropped area and the actual sensitive use itself. So if there are sensitive uses on 3 sides that require setbacks, and there is no sensitive use on the 4th side, then that's where you would put the crop to meet that particular standard. And I think I'm anticipating your next question, but maybe not. What happens if somebody puts a sensitive use in after the crop is actually put on that property? Well, there's nothing that I'm suggesting would prevent that from happening, but that person may be impacted by that crop. So as you probably are well aware, MDS is intended to work both ways. And essentially, whatever is first is protected, right? So it's basically the same philosophy. So if someone was able to meet the 300 meters and start cultivating cannabis, and somebody came by later to build a home, well, that person building the home will be disadvantaged potentially because of the cannabis crop that's nearby. But it is what it is, to use your saying, in terms of how that's supposed to work.
Okay, so just to be clear then, let's just use the example where it's only on one side. You would
Yeah.
pull back 300 meters from where the crop was grown to where the sensitive use is. And it could be an arc, because if it's only, if you, Phil's going to be able to jump on me very quickly. If it's 2,000 feet, if we're talking about 100 acres square, and the sensitive use is only making up 400 of those feet in the middle, you would have an arc around that, not just pull the whole thing back, right? Because that's how an empty nest works. So that's what you're looking at. Now, in that, using that example, in the three sides that didn't have a sensitive use, would you still say there's a 50-meter setback, or would you be able to do it right up to the lot line?
You know, it's a good point, because we didn't actually directly address that. I would still recommend a 50-meter setback no matter what. And that would be not in addition to the 300, but it would be in the 300, right? So that's a very good point. The 50-meter setback is something I can still support from a character perspective. And the main reason for that is because you have to fence these cultivated areas with fencing that sometimes is unattractive, with security apparatus and so on. So it's basically a character thing. So I would continue to recommend the 50-meter setback no matter what.
Wouldn't one of the fundamental ways to correct this issue, not just for us, but for everybody, is if the province didn't specifically did not said, in terms of the MDS, cannabis is not a field crop. Cannabis is something in and by itself, and the MDS arc would apply. Wouldn't that be the simplest, most straightforward fix to this?
Yeah, that would be a great fix, obviously, and I am aware of the OMAFRA being on this issue. MDS, as you know, deals with livestock and anaerobic digesters and manure storage and that kind of thing. It's really set up for, those types of uses. It is not set up for cannabis. OMAFRA has indicated that if they were ever going to do something to deal with odor issues from cannabis, they would come out with a separate guideline that deals specifically with cannabis, and so as to not confuse it with the other MDS that's already applied. So yes, that would be perfect. If that was there, then you can just sit back and let those guidelines do their work as MDS is supposed to work, and you would be secure, I guess, in knowing that impacts would be minimized.
Well, and that's what we do in lots of issues where we employ MDS. So let me just move, because we're going to have to come to some conclusion here. So Donna made a really excellent point about the presentation, and therefore about how it's going to have to be presented to us. It's confusing to move back and forth between indoor and outdoor. So when things are brought back to us in terms of recommendations that would actually be a draft bylaw, that distinction be made very, very clear, so that it's easy for us to follow. This is the rules for outdoor, this is the rules for indoor, and that we can follow that easily. I think Sherry's question about medical cannabis, to staff, I think getting a legal opinion, as you suggested, is probably an appropriate thing to do. Now, I know the federal government, and correct me if I'm wrong, is in the process of reviewing the medical applications, and Phil brought up one of the significant points between how the usage has gone up, and so we may want to wait until that's over. I don't know, but I think, to Sherry's point, getting a legal opinion is probably a good idea, because we could go through all of this stuff in terms of indoor production and the outdoor, make all the changes, and then find out that somebody's got a medical license and none of it applies, right? So I would say that. So colleagues, in going ahead, there seems to be, and I'm going to say some things, and as soon as I say something that people don't agree with, is to have changes made in our existing bylaw consistent with the recommendations that are in this report, and that would be 300. That would be 300 meters, and that we would like, as a next step as a council, to see what that would look like in terms of a bylaw, making it clear the distinction between indoor and outdoor. And to those of the public that are listening, when we would do that by law, not, and we would do it anyways, but by law, that is subject to a public meeting, so that each and every resident who has an interest will have an opportunity to provide their comment about what they would think on that altered proposal. That's if colleagues, and just to reiterate, and I'm going to do it again in a second in a different form when I answer the questions, that any bylaw change that we would undertake would apply from that point forward. It does not apply retroactive. Okay, and I say that because I think it's important for perhaps people in the audience that are watching to know that. Colleagues, did I capture what you would be looking at for next steps? I see Sherry is nodding and Anita is nodding. Donna wants to say something.
Yeah, just I would like to see the maximum restrictions that are defensible, that you consider defensible, to be put in. Like the absolute maximum that you think we could. If you think we could do 350 distance separations and defend that, then I'd like to see 350. And anything that could be put to the maximum, I'd appreciate that, because this first go round and the one particular property that we've had to deal with is a very unfortunate situation for the people that live in the area.
To that point, Nick, has there been an LPAT ruling on that issue of setbacks that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of an LPAT hearing specifically on that setback. I am aware of a circumstance where an application was not supported because of an insufficient setback. So no, I'm not aware of a specific hearing. I am relying upon the practices or the experiences of particularly the County of Norfolk, which has considerable experience with this particular issue. And I believe virtually every other municipality in Ontario is relying upon the County of Norfolk. It's a single tier, so they have a zoning bylaw as a county, and what they've done to support it. So based on that, I'm able to support the 300 meters as well.
Okay. And so in your in the next step where we're bringing forward a plan or a revision, if we could have a one-pager, expression I use, where you are justifying the amount that's being recommended specifically as to that's what I think is defensible, and I don't think anything higher than that would be. It's an opinion, and it'll be accepted as an opinion, because you could have a ruling next week that makes your opinion inoperative. We get it. Donna?
Very happy to do that. Thank you.
One other thing, I'm not sure who would investigate the odor nuisance bylaw has been indicated from the municipality of Pelham. Would it be our staff, or would you as consultants investigate that? That was mentioned by somebody.
Yeah. Is that in your scope? If it isn't, then I think the direction, because I think we all want to look into that. If it isn't in your scope, then the direction would be to staff.
Yeah. I could speak to that. I think to Nick's point, I think that's kind of, it's not a, like it's a strictly a planning matter. It'd be more of a bylaw enforcement issue, right? So I think it's probably something more akin to what township staff would look into. But
okay. Fair enough. So take it in addition to the other things that I said. I think council would be desirous of you looking into that and reporting back to us on that as well. Okay. But
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
yes.
Yeah, sorry, just wanted to clarify as well that you're forming your resolution, that you would also want to get the legal opinion as part of that resolution?
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Okay, so why don't I shouldn't make it. I sort of outlined what would be in it, but somebody needs to make it. So, okay, Anita's got her hand up. She's going to try to take a stab at this. Okay, Anita, go for it.
If I could get Angie to sort of read back her notes as to how the motion would look like.
Yes, I can do that. So that the consultant would be directed to bring a new draft bylaw back to council for consideration consistent with the report provided today. That the bylaw essentially be categorized by indoor type and outdoor type. That an opinion brief be provided as well, that would outline what would be defensible to LPAT in terms of the setback in the opinion of the planner. That a legal opinion be sought regarding the use of medical cannabis, and that staff investigate an odor nuisance bylaw and bring that back for council at a future date.
Sounds good to me.
So Anita moved. Do we have a seconder? Donna is seconding it. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you, colleagues. And thank you to our consultants for the work that you've done and what was a very thorough presentation and taking the time to answer all of these questions. We will see you back at some point I'm hoping and thinking the not too distant future with some recommendations. So that will end that part of the meeting, and we're going to go on to the Q&A portion. There were a number of people who asked questions. I will say that many of the questions have, I think, been answered by this, but we're still going to go through it. I'm going to start off by just making a couple of statements, and Nick, if you could just stay on the line for a minute, and Rob, I'm going to just make some opening comments on the Q&A to cover what will end up being a number of the answers. So first of all, and I'm reiterating some of the points that were already made. So the growing and processing of cannabis is a legal activity in Canada. Okay? OMAFRA has deemed cannabis as an agricultural commodity that can be grown by right in areas zoned rural and agriculture. The bylaw governing the growing and production of cannabis in the township of Selwyn was passed in January of 2020. Prior to that date, cannabis cultivation was not permitted due to the township's implementation of an interim control bylaw. Any application made after passage of that bylaw in January of 2020 are governed by the provisions of that bylaw. And finally, changes to the zoning bylaw, such as those that have been recommended in the Meridian report, once passed, can only apply to new developments. The Planning Act prohibits municipalities from creating regulations that would prevent uses that are currently lawful. We cannot apply new rules retroactively. And so those are all givens. They're all things that we don't choose as a township. Those are the regulations and rules and legislation under which we operate. So, Nick or Rob, is any of that inaccurate?
From my perspective, that's entirely accurate. Thank you very much.
Rob?
Yeah, no, there was nothing that was inaccurate, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so in that context then, Madam Clerk, if let's go through the questions, and as I said, some of them are going to be have been dealt with in the course of this, and some of them I've just spoken to. But go ahead, Madam Clerk.
Thank you. I will just mention as well, we do have another meeting. It was actually to begin at 5. I did contact the other presenters, and they are able to meet a little bit later. So I suggested it might be closer to 5:30. Just wanted to let council members know that, and anybody else who may be trying to find out about the next meeting. So we do have a number of questions, and there were some preamble with a number of them. So I'm just going to try to get to the question itself. First question is from the Taylor family. According to the report, the odors are obnoxious for at least 2 kilometers. The real estate has appraised my home in excess of $900,000. Is Selwyn going to reimburse me for my financial loss, which according to the real estate could be as much as 50%? And have there been any site inspections?
Okay, well, I'll ask Rob to do on the site inspections. So look, we acknowledge and appreciate the concerns that homeowners have, but it is not a practice to compensate for financial losses that a result of a change in appraised value of homes. Rob, did you want to talk about the property inspection?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I can see that the township staff attended the property twice in response to being informed of the community's concerns with what was going on in some of the buildings. The accessory buildings are on the property at 290 Cork. So we coordinated our efforts with the OPP and the Office of the Fire Marshal, and we did confirm with the OPP that they had established that there was no criminality occurring on the property, but we did want to inspect the property for compliance with the building code and in compliance with the zoning bylaw. So we were given access to the structure on the property during our second visit, and as a result of our inspections, we issued orders under the building code and the fire code.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. The next question is from Shannon Selkirk Ferrier. The question is, it is clear that 290 Cork Line is not an appropriate location for an outdoor cannabis grow farm, given the close proximity to a residential neighborhood. Can Selwyn impose any new regulations or updated bylaws related to cannabis cultivation at this location?
I think we kind of addressed that. So we can change our zoning bylaw, and we are considering it, but it does not apply retroactively. So we can't. The 290, the Cork Line operation is subject to, first of all, a federal license, and then to the bylaw that we put in place in January of 2020.
Thank you. The next question is from Charles Ferrier. With the current bylaw 2020-002 stating a minimum 50-meter setback, and knowing in the fall of 2020 that 290 Cork Line was a planned cannabis grow operation, why did Selwyn Planning Department apply only a 50-meter setback instead of 100 to 500 meters?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but let me try it. When the application was made, and Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, the bylaw was already in place, and so when the application was made, the figure or the setback in the bylaw is the one that would be applied. So in this particular case, we passed the bylaw in January. We established 50 meters. Then the application came in, and therefore the 50 meters was what applied. Rob, is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, it just goes to kind of reiterate our earlier statements, Mr. Chair, that indeed what the rules that apply to regulate cannabis are the rules that we passed in January of 2020, and they are the 50-meter setback. Our goal, of course, is to change that, but until that's changed, the current rules will have to continue to apply.
Thank you, Rob. Next question.
Thank you. Next question is from Lily Ferrier. How will the township or Selwyn Township prevent the effects of odor emissions, particulate, spray, droplet drift, and light emissions from the production site on the surrounding areas and properties?
Okay, that's reasonably technical, so I'm going to ask Rob to do that one.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. So So yeah, so we don't have the benefit in this particular context to apply site plan. And I think certainly Nick spoke to that quite a bit during the presentation and afterwards with council's questions. So when we have site plan, we can impose requirements that relate to lighting and to garbage storage and all those things. But this application at 290 Cork is an agricultural application. It's not development as defined in the Planning Act. So consequently, we cannot apply site plan control. But I can say that we have spoken with the applicant and we've asked them to be cognizant of all the issues that have been brought to us from the community. And they have pledged to do what they can to mitigate a number of the concerns that have been provided in terms of improving the visual barrier, some additional plantings, ensuring that they use dark sky lighting. There's another commitment that they've made that they're going to draw water from the lake as opposed from the aquifer. So, I mean, we've heard, good responses to their, and that they're going to make an effort to address some of the concerns that have been brought to us by the public.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Next question.
Thank you. Next question is Dr. Scott Ferrier. With the extensive use of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers by inexperienced growers, how is Selwyn Township going to ensure the land and well water and lake water does not become contaminated?
Okay, we kind of got into this discussion earlier about when we talked about herbicides, pesticides, and best farm or normal farm practices and some of the regulations under the Ministry of the Environment. I wonder if somebody from Meridian, from your team, Nick, could speak to this one a little bit.
I certainly don't have any direct knowledge of how that is dealt with through MECP. I would turn to Louis or Phil if you could add to this because you're in the field, so to speak.
Louis, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and that is a concern by many. All the crop protection products, pesticides, and fungicides are all regulated by Health Canada. So the use of herbicides and hard pesticides or any agricultural pesticides are prohibited to be used on a cannabis crop. So they have products that are, for mildew control. They have a product that's called Millstop, which is a potassium bicarbonate, similar to what we have in our refrigerators. And that's used to control, and that would be applied for their mildew. When they have an aphid problem, just like we may have an aphid problem in the garden, they can't go and apply any pesticides or any agricultural pesticides, like maybe a cash crop producer or a fruit producer may apply. They have to use, again, Health Canada approved products, and these are basically biorational or environmentally friendly products. That is an issue with designated growers or these, medical licensed growers that grow for prescriptions. My experience is, because I provide a lot of equipment for operations, but when I start asking what they will apply, the licensed producers follow the act to the letter of the law because the consequences are quite expensive. I cannot say the same for the designated growers.
Okay, thank you. And if somebody has a concern in that respect, can they request that somebody go in and inspect what's taking place? Do you know that, Lou?
No, I've spoken to the MECP, Mr. Chair, and they will attend a concern related to the application, the improper application of a herbicide or pesticide.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Next question.
Thank you. The next question is from Bruce and Sylvie McLean, and they actually asked the same question that was just answered.
Okay, so that one's been done. Okay, next one.
Next question is from Rick Rosat. Given the background information from the Meridian report of December 2019, why does Selwyn Township and Council believe and take the position that 290 Cork line should proceed with the current 50-meter setback for their proposed cannabis grow op.
So
Again, I think this may have been answered already.
we're not able to change the regulations retroactively. The setback that will apply is the one that was put in place for the bylaw in January of 2020. Next.
Next question is from Jane Rosat. Will Selwyn Township enforce strict regulations for the handling and disposal of waste cannabis byproducts so there is not any impact on sensitive land use and surrounding properties?
If I understand correctly, agricultural practices must follow the provincial best farm practices, which include managing waste byproducts for crop cultivation. And I don't know, Louis, if you wanted to add more to that.
The again, licensed growers have to what they call denature the product. It is a controlled substance when it is got levels of THC or CBDs. So how they denature the product is through mixing, shredding the product, mixing it with either a kitty litter, mixing it with straw, mixing it with peat moss, shavings, sawdust, whatever it might be. But it needs to be first of all, denatured or brought down to a compost. And then the landowner is permitted to dispose of it at their will. They do need a witness, from what I understand in the Cannabis Act, that when they are denaturing the product, that has to also be witnessed by somebody on site that will sign for that. Stems and root balls are not considered contaminants. They're actually considered beneficial. There's fiber in them, and they're looking for alternative uses in textiles and whatnot. But there is a process that a licensed producer must follow.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Next question is from Sylvie McLean. Might be similar to an earlier one. What compensation will Selwyn Township provide to us for the adverse effects and well water contamination that will occur?
Well, as I noted earlier, the township does not compensate private owners for changes in appraised value. And Louis, did you want to add to the one about the well?
Yeah, I think one consideration that is a strong one. Whenever an agricultural property is got a old well, there are provisions by and maybe Phil has comment on that. Wells do need to be safe. They do have to be either decommissioned or reconstructed, because if you have a wellhead that is below the ground line, that's a direct conduit into the well. When there is no direct conduit, it's really no different than any other farming operation.
Thanks, Louis. Next question.
Next question is from Dorothy Jackson. She actually has a few points. Our questions are, will it bring unlawful activity to the area? Will it affect the sale of our properties? Will the grow and the maintenance of it affect the environment around us and beyond? Are the owners of the grow obeying the guidelines for it?
Well, it's hard to answer. It's hard to answer those questions other than to say the applicant or the grower is subject to the provisions under licensing, which is provided by the federal government. They would have to adhere to that. We have guidelines as a township, our land use guidelines, which we are now contemplating on changing, and so they would come into effect as
well. Next question is from Bill Book. Odor emissions, how will this be monitored? What fines will be imposed for infractions?
Okay, good question, and I think council had the same question, and so we directed staff to present to us what a monitoring system could look like in terms of putting a bylaw in place for odors. And then I think there was an extensive presentation on how you would deal with it on indoor cultivation that was part of the Meridian presentation today. Next question.
Next question is from Michael Muir. And again, I think it's an answer that's already been given. Essentially, how can the operation at 290 Cork Line be permitted as it's located between two residential properties?
Again, Mike, as we said earlier, it falls under the bylaw that was put in place in January. So those rules would apply, and any changes that we make, we cannot retroactively apply them. Next question.
Next question is from Gord Duncan. How will the buffer strip be enforced, and when will that happen at 290 Cork?
Okay, if Rob, why don't because you've been dealing with on this particular issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the 50-meter setback that we've been speaking to between the lot line and the crop actually comes into effect the time that an application is approved by Health Canada. So what we can do is monitor compliance with the setback. In this case, it's fairly obvious because there's essentially a fence built at the 42-meter or 45-meter distance, and so if there's essentially a crop inside the fence, it's compliant with our 50-meter setback. If there's a violation of that, of course, we would report that to Health Canada and hope that they would enforce their regulations as well. But we would have an ability to enforce the regulation through the courts if necessary as well. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Rob. Next question.
Next question is from Diane Muir. In the technical memorandum, April 28th, under community outdoor impact outdoor complaints on page 1 and 2, that enforcement is lacking. What inspection and enforcement procedure will Selwyn Township put in place? Will this be applied to the Cork Line site?
Perhaps, whether it be Phil or whoever can speak to that phrase, the enforcement is lacking, that was on page 1 and 2 in the technical memorandum.
Yeah, so those are included just to reflect the fact that despite the federal prohibition against the release of odor from licensed facilities, there are community odor complaints across Canada. And I think there's clear evidence that although complaints go into Health Canada, they're not always acted upon or acted upon in a timely manner. And when they do come out, sometimes inspections don't focus on the odor, they focus on other aspects. So it's an observation that despite the regulations, Health Canada doesn't always address odor in a timely manner.
Okay, and that comment was primarily on indoor operations, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay, and the regulatory authority is the federal government, not the municipality.
That's correct. It's all licensed under Health Canada at the federal level.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Next question is from Helena Duncan. And again, she's asking a question related to 290 Cork Line, the 50-meter setback, and wanting to know if the new setback could be applied.
Unfortunately, any change that we make is not applied retroactively. Next question.
Next question is from Sharon Stafford. Again, she's concerned about the current conditions created at 290 Cork Line. What will the council do to rectify this and return the residents of Cork Line and Parkwood Shores back to the life and community that your actions took away from us?
Well, let me just start. I understand there's probably still a lot of debate and concern, but as I said at the beginning, cannabis production, growing and processing is illegal. Is legal in this country now. The ability to grow it, since it's defined outdoors, is defined as an agricultural commodity. People have it by right to be able to do that. The township, on its land use planning, put in place a setback that applies to this particular application, in addition to all of the prohibitions that would be in the licensing that the applicant is required to get. And in addition to that, as Rob mentioned in an earlier question, at the request of council, we made a number of requests to the applicant to make a number of changes, some of which they've agreed to do, and some of which they have chosen not to do. Next question.
Next question is from Carl and Casey Letty. Again, this has been answered, but the question really is, why would a cannabis cultivation be adjacent to a residential property where children reside?
As well, it's really basically the same answer. It's a legal commodity. People have a right to grow it. We have put a bylaw in place. We are returning back to that subject to make additional changes to it. But as we've said earlier, they cannot be applied retroactively. Next question.
Next question is from Teresa and Neil James. Sorry, there's a little bit of preamble here, just trying to get to the question. I think, again, they're concerned about the 290 cork. Would you on council like this in your backyard? We already had a problem last winter. Sorry, I think that they're just expressing concern over the fact that the operation is there.
Who's that question from?
It's number 18, Teresa and Neil James.
Okay. Well, I think one of the issues, just to clarify, Robin, if you would, the actual property itself, although it's adjacent to a residential area, it's my understanding that the property itself is zoned rural, and as such, it permits agricultural uses such as cannabis cultivation. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's right, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the current zoning bylaw allows for agricultural activity to take place on properties that are zoned agriculture or rural. And as has been discussed at length, the outdoor propagation of cannabis is an agricultural use, and so is permitted in a rural zone. Yeah.
And so one of the ways that we're looking to address that going forward is if you're adjacent to a residential area, then that I'm going to call it the MDS ARC, but it's the MDS ARC-like process would come into play, and you would be moving back 300 meters. So, yes, but that, as we said earlier, cannot be applied retroactively. Okay, next question.
Thank you. And just for your information, Mr. Chair, I believe I mixed up question 18 and 19. They were all one question from Mr. and Mrs. James.
Okay.
So we're actually on question 20, which is, how will the township compensate the residents of Cork for any decreased property values, also noting, negative impacts to the community?
And I've answered this. It's not the practice to compensate private homeowners for any changes in appraised values of the property.
Next question is from Desiree Phillips. Why did Meridian on the May 13th tech memorandum not recommend to include bylaw grants officers the right to inspect cannabis cultivation site and order corrective actions and impose fines of $5,000 to $100,000 as necessary?
I think maybe I'll ask, I guess it would be Phil to answer that.
I think
I'll give that one a shot, even though it wasn't his report. I guess firstly, fines could be levied only through the court system if someone is not in compliance with a zoning bylaw, and Mr. Lamar can certainly comment on that. If there was non-compliance with an agreement entered into, well, there are remedies there, but I don't think they involve fines. So the township can, if someone is not in compliance with the bylaw, for example, that individual decides to move his crop 40 meters instead of 50 meters from the lot line, the township can charge that person for being not in compliance. And Mr. Lamar can take you through the process that ensues from there, which quite frankly could result in many, many different things happening. So I'll stop there and let Mr. Lamar answer.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Indeed, yeah. So if indeed there was a violation, as noted, maybe the crop is 40 meters from the lot line as opposed to 50, that would constitute a violation of our zoning bylaw. And so we can pursue a charge through the Provincial Offences Act. It would be a Part 3 summons. So we would convince Justice of the Peace that what's happening is inappropriate, and we would then deliver, a summons to the landowner, and they would be summoned to court. Some months later, given COVID, some difficulty with the courts, but in the end, a hearing would be convened, and we would ask the courts to levy a fine, and the Justice of the Peace would levy a fine that he or she deems appropriate.
Okay. Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, we've got two more. We're almost done. It's from John Finney. What ongoing monitoring protocols will be in place to monitor air quality and groundwater quality given such close proximity to residential communities and sensitive natural habitat? And what triggers will be established to demand remedial action? And will council commit to ensuring any such protocols and triggers should be extra stringent given setbacks on this property are minimal and do not meet best practices?
Well, on the odor side, I think council in this meeting have given direction to staff to work up a protocol on exactly that. In terms of water quality, Rob, there's a process right now. Maybe you could just sort of describe that.
So groundwater quality. Yeah. So yeah, I think we've heard a little bit about how there's a concern from the community about how this particular operator might use pesticides, and I think we've heard, and I've certainly in my discussions with CanDelta, who are supporting the landowner in their application to the federal government, they've been very clear to me that that the place or the use of herbicides and pesticides in a cannabis crop is highly regulated. There's to be very little residual on the end product. It's something that's consumed in a very particular manner, and they have very strict guidelines as it relates to any residual chemicals that are on the product when it finally comes to market. So producers are loath to use chemicals that are obviously going to contravene and impact on the value of their crop. So I think that will go some way to mitigating just how much product is used on the property, right? In addition to that, if they are using a chemical, that there are avenues that the community can avail themselves of by complaining to the Ministry of the Environment, and they will have an inspector attend to ensure that whatever product's being used is being used in a way that's consistent with the relevant rules, right? So I think it's as much as I think I can talk to as it relates to impacts on water quality.
Thank you, Rob. I think we have one more question.
That's correct. It's from Tracy Bell. She actually has a few questions, sorry. What can local residents do to try and prevent further cannabis grow-ops from being located in the township? Can we pass a local bylaw that anyone considering an application for an operation must pay for regular water testing starting before the operation becomes active and monthly thereafter for residents within a certain radius? And can notice of council meetings agendas be posted at the library, community center, and local businesses that have bulletin boards?
Well, I'll take a stab at the first one. And if somebody correct me if I'm wrong, the growing and processing of cannabis is a legal activity. And although it's controlled through a licensing process through the federal government, and we put land use planning provisions in place, the reality is doing that activity is legal. We have controls over it, but it's legal. So it would be very, very difficult to in fact, I would say we are not in a position to outlaw or to disallow it outright in our community. The second part of that in terms of testing, clearly if it's an indoor operation and we're doing a zoning bylaw, there will be a whole set of conditions and studies that are done to deal with the issue. In terms of the outdoor, in terms of mandating water testing, I'm not sure. Nick, is that something that you're able to do with an outdoor operation?
Not to the best of my knowledge. Certainly, they don't require any permission from the township at all. There is no ability for the township to require them to test other wells in the area. Certainly, if a adjacent property owner ever has a concern about their particular well being affected by another private property, then there are remedies through the court system for that don't involve the municipality. The only time the municipality gets involved is if there is a Planning Act approval given and agreements entered into which require monitoring and testing and the submission of monitoring reports to the township on a regular basis.
Thank you. And the last question was about trying to make sure that our council meetings and agendas be posted so that everybody had an opportunity to see them. Tracy, identified libraries, community centers, and local businesses. Well, the first two are closed, and the third ones right now are some of them are open and some of them aren't. But having said that, we do use social media and online platforms to advertise all of our council meetings. But in addition, as I mentioned earlier, any changes to a proposed bylaw would trigger a public meeting. And we will do everything that we can to let people know that when that public meeting is occurring. I'm going to guess, I don't know, because I can't predict when COVID restrictions will be eliminated. So if it's like it is now, that meeting will happen online, but people will have an opportunity to participate. I have to compliment our deputy mayor, who is the chair of our minor variance, who's got this down to a science in terms of allowing people on public meetings regarding planning matters to participate. And so we've got a fairly good process to allow the public to get involved, and we will make sure that anybody who wants to have an opportunity for an intervention at that public meeting, if we have to do it online, we will make sure that we provide a vehicle online to do it. I should mention, and Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, if somebody prefers not to do it online or prefers not to do it on camera, or actually even coming to a meeting, they can make those presentations in writing, and they become part of the public comments in terms of the proposed changes. I think I had that right, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that comes before the meeting, we certainly consider and provide that to council so that you can have regard for it when you make your decision as well.
And as I think Nick mentioned at one point, anything that we decide is subject to appeal. He's nodding.
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah. So that is the end of the question period, and I know we've gone over time on those, but I thought it was important that we address everybody's question. So, colleagues, all we need now is a motion to adjourn, and it is 5:42. We will reconvene at 5:50. Donna?
Well, we just, sorry, we need a confirming bylaw, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, it's great that we got a clerk to keep me on the straight and narrow. Donna? Oh, you're moving the confirming bylaw. Anita, okay, all those in favor? Passed. Now we need a motion to adjourn by Anita, seconded by Donna. All those in favor. To all of our presenters, to Meridian, thank you very much for being here. All of the staff who've been supporting us, thank you very much. And colleagues and council, we will reconvene at 5:50. That gives it just a short break. Is there a separate Zoom address, or Andrew?
Yeah, yes, there is.
Okay, so
And
sign
it's
off.
in your,
So we
Okay.
have to close out of this?
correct. Close out of this one and look for your Outlook calendar for your second link.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, everybody. Talk to you very shortly. Bye-bye.
Good evening.